I'm with Peter Levine. Hi, Peter.
Hi.
So, in your new upcoming book, you talk about a very dramatic incident. Do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Sure, gladly. This is something that happened about 5 years ago. And I was walking out of my house. It was one of those beautiful Southern California mornings. It was kind of a morning where nothing could go wrong except something terribly did go wrong. I was walking to the restaurant and crossing the street, and a teenager ran through the stop sign through the crosswalk, and she hit me at about 25 miles an hour. And I was thrown up in the air and landed on the rock, or on the road. And at that moment, I didn't know where I was. I was disoriented, and then from my helpless perspective, a bunch of people came towards me, and they felt like a flock of carnivorous ravens swooping down on injured prey. And slowly I oriented myself to identify the real attacker. And, almost like these flashbulb pictures, black and white pictures, I saw a beige car over me with its teeth-like grille and a shattered windshield. Mm-hmm. And a wide-eyed teenager burst out. And I couldn't put what had happened. I didn't, I couldn't comprehend what had happened, and everything seemed to be in fragments.
Yeah.
And then a man rushed down and he said, "I'm an off-duty paramedic," and he loudly commanded me, "Don't move your head." And I tried to follow his order, but at the same time, my natural instinct was to orient to where the voice was coming from.
Yeah.
So that put me back in this state of paralysis. And thankfully, a woman a few minutes later came by, and she announced herself as a doctor, a pediatrician, and asked if there was anything that she could do. And I said, "Yes, please just sit here. Just sit by me." And she took her hand and held my hand. And this contact, the physical holding of hand and the sound of her voice, were very important in helping me stabilize enough and orient to do what I needed to do next, which I'll describe to you. Mm-hmm. Something that therapists, of course, need to do with their traumatized and upset, agitated clients. They have to create in a direct somatic way through voice, through touch. Voice is sometimes called prosody. It's the way a mother talks to her infant, for example, that kind of rhythmical expression. And so anyhow, and also the physical touch, being able to hold her hand. I've worked with trauma, for over 40 years, and to have it becomes so clear why we do some of the things that we do.
So in a way, what that experience was about is, for 40 years you've known it, but this was your experience of it while in the thick of it, and not in the place of knowledge, but in the place of being traumatized.
Potentially being traumatized. I was in a direct experience. I was experiencing what I had written about and taught for 40 years. Mm-hmm. Of course, I did work on my own traumas, but there's something different when you're right in the middle of it. And you really are in a life or death situation.
Yeah.
So anyhow, when this woman, we made contact, I was able to go into my body and to be able to feel the extreme level of arousal, and through the kind of somatic tracking, which I describe in my books, and I was able to come out of the state of hyperarousal and dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
Able to return to my body, and as part of that, I would experience some of the things that my body had done to protect myself, to defend myself. I mean, you can't defend yourself from a car coming to hit you, but I did because I had just put my hands out enough so that my head did not hit against the windshield.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was thrown out into the road, I felt my other hand extending and protecting my head from impacting the road. So, but actually experienced, because see, when I was laying in a heap on the road, I felt completely helpless, completely overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the essence of the traumatic state. And that's how the traumatic state is registered in the body.
Right. You were feeling helpless, and actually, as you were able to, where you were calming down, you were able to notice actually you hadn't been as helpless as you thought, and you had some movements that were protecting yourself.
Exactly, and that's what happens with traumatized people. When we're traumatized, that is to say, we are overwhelmed and experience ourselves as defenseless. But it's not true. Everybody has internal defenses, body defenses, that began to be executed, but they were overwhelmed, but they're still there. They're latently held in the body, waiting for the possibility to complete itself in meaningful action. So, for example, a person who is raped, they're held down. Or a person who has a child that has a surgery, and they used to do tonsillectomies with ether, and the nurses and doctors would be holding them down while they would put the mask over the children, which absolutely terrified them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a struggle. They try to escape, but then they were completely overwhelmed by the rape, by the ether, by being hit by a car. So all of these things have the effect of creating a sense of helplessness and hyperarousal. So when I work with people, and maybe this would be the time to go back to kind of flashback 36.
Actually, I wanted to ask, just to make a point, when you were describing the accident that happened fairly recently, I used the word traumatized, and you responded by saying potentially traumatized, and maybe that's a good point to make, is how the same thing that can traumatize some people, with that intervention, with the thing that happened, with your knowledge, with that human intervention, you were able to actually not be traumatized.
Yes, actually, and afterwards, several of my friends had commented to saying to me that I seemed more centered and more alive, and I think that was true, and that is a very good point that you asked, because a trauma is, of course, I mean, when something really horrible happens, we have the possibility of being traumatized. But if we meet it in a certain way, either at the actual time, as in this case, or even years or decades later, we really reclaim our aliveness and our empowerment in a way which we may not have known had we not been traumatized and not transformed the trauma.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, I see it as a very personal, touching comment on your life's work, that in a way you're dealing with trauma, and you've also created a foundation for human enrichment, and in a way how much enrichment can come out of overcoming trauma.
Yes, so thank you. That was the idea of naming the organization in that way. That the trauma is a fact of life. However, trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And, as in the biblical story of Jonah, the unknowable forces of trauma and loss can swallow us whole. Entrapped in loss, we become hopelessly frozen. But even then, there is always some way that the body is connects with its deep resource, with the deep body self. Let me just skip briefly to a woman that I worked with, who was on I think it was the 80th floor of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, and after this, she couldn't sleep. She awoke screaming. She had lost all engagement with life. She used to love music. Now she couldn't stand to listen to music. And actually, she had seen an interview I did on television in New York, and of course, she wouldn't go into an airplane, but she came 3 days and nights by a train to do the session with me. Anyhow, when we begin the session, she talks really almost as though it were happening to somebody else, or talking in a cocktail party about the horror of being in the building, but in a completely neutral way. And you could see that it was from her shutdown. Mm-hmm. While she was telling the story, I noticed momentarily her hands made an opening gesture. Her hands and her arms a little bit made an opening gesture. And I said to the woman, I said, Sharon, just for now, we can go back to the story, but just for now, I'd just like you to notice what's going on with your hands. And what does it feel like if you actually put your awareness in your awareness into the physical sensations of your hands, the way they're open, the way they're reaching, and then boom, all of a sudden she said, "Oh, I see an image of the Hudson River." She would go across the Hudson River, every day to work, because she lived in New Jersey, and she's seeing the river and how beautiful the river it is, and seeing the boats going down the river. And she said, you can destroy a building, but you can't stop the river. So what she was saying was that she was connecting to her own life force.
Yeah.
And when I had her be able to really feel that in her body, then we had a place to go from. If I had just started to go right into her trauma, we would have been swallowed up, as I just said, like in the belly of the whale.
Right. But so what happened is, as she was talking, you were noticing that she was talking in a way that was not connecting to the emotions of it, but you noticed, you were tracking, you were observing the movement of her hands, and then by pointing something out about that, helped her connect to something in the movement of her hand that brought her to that place that was a larger container, something that was more peaceful, something that saw more than the existence of trauma or danger.
And in a way, you've hit on a key word here, Serge.
Yeah.
And that's the word container. And the body is the container for all of our sensations and our feelings. And the trouble with trauma is not so much the trauma, but that our container has shrunk in relationship to it. And so one of the things that we do in somatic experiencing is we really work with the person to widen that container. And again, that's when a person is able to do that, they start feeling. They start getting some sense of safety, because when you're traumatized, nothing feels safe anymore. Mm-hmm. Gradually, when people connect to these little pieces of experience in their body, I call them islands of safety. And you're in this stormy sea of trauma, but the person finds one island, like this woman did with her hand gestures. And then as we go on, then another one. And with me, it was my hands protecting my head, showing me proving to me had power, that I hadn't lost all my power, that I wasn't helpless. And so when people put these islands of safety together, you get a little one here, all of a sudden you get a bigger island of safety, and you're able to really confront the raging, storming seas of trauma by not being overwhelmed. See, the problem in many of the older treatments of trauma, and actually some of the treatments of trauma that are going on, that are still used, the person is really made to relive the trauma or remember the worst part of their trauma and abreact it. And I don't doubt that it benefits some people, but many, many other people are completely overwhelmed by that. It's not necessary.
Right.
The key, again, is to build, if you think about the self or the body self, you can think of the self to trauma ratio. If the trauma is very large, then you have to help contain that trauma with a larger self, with a greater body self.
Right. So what you had when we were talking about container, you're saying that trauma is something that can be, or the threat or the danger or the stress is so big that actually it's bigger than the container. And so the point is, if you throw the person back into it, you still don't have the container, and you have to really build the container so that there is room for that stress, that danger, that threat.
Yes, exactly. And then the person is able to find themselves again.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, let me go back and give you another specific example of how I really started in this whole field, this whole area.
Yeah.
And this is something that happened about 40 years ago. And I was, at that time, I was hanging out at Esalen, and I was developing a series of mind-body healing, of body awareness as a way to cultivate deep relaxation. And I've been doing my doctoral work in medical biophysics at UC Berkeley, and I took a leave of absence and spent several months at Esalen, really meeting people and learning about these different sensory kinds of sensory awareness systems and body therapy systems. Fitz Perls was there, Ida Rawls, Will Schutz. It was Abraham Maslow was there. It was really quite an exciting place. It was more fun than plodding along on my doctoral. So anyhow, when I got back to Berkeley, where I was living at the time, this friend of mine, colleague, he is a psychiatrist, and he worked with this woman named Nancy, or that I call Nancy, and she had been referred to him by some internist, and she had a whole panoply of somatic symptoms. She had severe migraines, PMS, what would be called fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue now, and she had an extreme panic anxiety disorder, and she was so severe that she was not able to really leave the house except if she was accompanied by her husband. And so the psychiatrist reasoned, and he tried some medication with her with very limited results. So he asked me if I would see her to do some of my body-oriented relaxation work with her. And so she came in, and she was with her husband, and she was terrified. Her pulse was about 100 beats a minute. I could see that on her carotid artery and the carotid pulse. And her husband, you could see, was just utterly burdened with having her being so completely dependent on him.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, I tried to, be as reassuring as I could to both of them, and invited her to come in to the room. And I started doing the relaxation on the neck and jaw. And as I did this, I could see her heart rate was dropping. It was going from, for about 100 down to 80 or 90, 80, and 75. And I was, like pretty pleased with myself.
Mm-hmm.
I really, but not for long. And just as it had gone down, it shot up even more quickly. And the rate went up to about 140 beats a minute. And I was like pretty, a little bit more than anxious, a little bit anxious myself. And I said awkwardly about the stupidest thing you could say, which was, Nancy, just relax. You just need to relax. But her heart rate started to go down, and I think, oh, okay, well, we're back in the game again. But it went down and down and down to a very low rate of about 50 beats per minute. And she was pale. She was like a ghost. And she could barely speak. Her throat was constricted, and she, in that constricted voice, she said, "Doctor, I'm dying. I'm dying. I'm dying. Don't let me die. Don't let me die." And then, at that moment, in my own near panic, I saw an image of a tiger at the far end of the room. And I commanded to her without knowing really why at the moment. I mean, this was something obviously that this situation brought out in my own unconscious, my own archetypal unconscious. And I said, "Nancy, there's a tiger. There's a tiger chasing you. Run, climb those rocks and escape." And to both of our amazement, her legs started shaking and trembling, but it was also moving as though it were running. And I could tell from her fingers that they would become icy cold, and then she would experience tremendous heat. And these waves with shaking and trembling and the running movements and changes in the autonomic nervous system, i.e. heart rate, temperature, that went on for a better part of an hour, maybe about 40 minutes. And at the end, she looked up and she said, "I feel held in tingling waves of warmth." And then she said, "Do you want me to tell you what happened?" And I said, "Yeah, actually." She said, "When you gave me that command, at first I felt I couldn't run. It wouldn't be possible. But it encouraged me enough that I started to run, and then I could really feel myself run. And I could feel the power in my legs, and I could feel myself climbing the rocks. And when I got on top, I had a picture of when I was 4 years old. I had a tonsillectomy, an ether tonsillectomy. And I was held down. She said she was held down by doctors and nurses while they forced the ether mask over her mouth. And her body, just like my body tried to protect itself from the car and from the road, her body had tried to protect itself by fighting against the doctors. And her body was wanting to run, the fight and flight response, run and escape from that room and to run to the comfort of her parents. But of course she couldn't do it at 4 years old, but she could do it at 24 years old. So she, retroactively what I did in the present moment. And then, of course, I was curious about a number of things. First of all, where in the world did this image come from? And then it occurred to me I had been taking a graduate seminar in the zoology department on ecology, the study of animals in their natural environment. And the professor had mentioned an arcane reference to something that was called animal hypnosis. And if animals are restrained, and particularly if they're restrained in a fearful state, they go into an immobile state where they can't move. And they stay in this shock, immobile state anywhere from minutes to 20 hours. And they stay in depending on how much, the greater the fear, the longer they stay in. And often when people start coming out of the immobility, the intensity of the sensations and the preparation for self-protection in the form of rage counterattack is in itself frightening, so it puts them back in the immobility response. anyhow, then I began, basically a lifelong research into behaviors.
Is it okay if I interrupt you for a moment, Peter? The story is so rich that in a way I would like to stop for a moment and digest a couple of angles of it. And there is something, of course, about the trauma situation that you describe in it, but there is also something that is very powerful about the practitioner and your involvement in this situation. And a couple of things strike me as I hear you tell the story. I mean, first is how, you were into the biomechanical, biophysics part. Yeah, tracking the heart rate literally with a monitor, and so really but in a way, in a situation of very much tracking the physical. And at the same time, what happened and what was a transformative experience was that at the same time as you were tracking, something happened to you in response, in resonance with what was happening to the patient, to the woman, and brought on some images. And through that resonance of yours, you were able to respond to her in a way that actually created her own, a healing environment for her.
Yes, right, boy, you're right on track there. Somatic resonance is the most important tool, possibly the most important tool that any therapist can have. The ability to resonate with another person. Now, you don't pick up exactly what they're feeling, but you do pick up something like that. And particularly as therapists get to know their own inner landscape, their own self-sense, then they can really relatively easily differentiate between what's their own kind of experience, what their own experience is. So, for example, I felt fear, but that was my own fear. I was doing. But then when I was able to, and again, I was just barely developing my own body sense at that time, but when the therapist is able to resonate, and that's the key term, I think, is resonate with another person, then they can really track their sensations, and by observing what's going on in the physiological systems. Like I don't have a heart rate monitor, but I can see the heart rate. I don't have biofeedback things on the fingers for temperature, but I can see the temperature. I can see when the face gets red. I can see when there's a mottling of red and white. I can see, of course, when the person turns pale. So all of that is giving me a window into the non-voluntary, instinctual part of our brains, the so-called reptilian structures of our brains, the real primitive parts of our brains. And so we're able to actually dialogue with the client at that level, and that's really what it takes to help them guide them through the sensations that are associated with trauma, these fragmentary sensations, and to put them together in a coherent whole so the person can return to being able to be in the here and now. So that really is what must guide therapists, and it's something that comes from practice and from trusting. Actually, after I started seeing more and more clients, that's when I started to begin to, people had asked me if I could train them in that. And I, quite frankly, I had no idea how I would train people because I didn't have the words for it. So I spent many years trying to get the words to describe what happened. And actually then I eventually wrote my first book, Waking the Tiger. And this is something that I'm jumping around a little bit, I know. A couple of weekends ago, Bessel van der Kolk and I taught a class at Esalen Institute. We've been doing that every year for about 10 years. And this was a group of therapists this time who had virtually no experience with body-oriented work, with body psychotherapy or body work. And it was really lovely. And Bessel is probably one of the leading, he is the leading figure both in the neuroscience of trauma, but in really getting this out to to people who are clinicians.
Mm-hmm.
And in this group, it's about 65 people. I would say a good 60 people really had never known that you could do anything but talk.
Mm-hmm.
And to see this kind of awakening really tickled us both. And I think what we're seeing, and I think the USABP and the European Body Association have really been at the forefront of kind of collecting or bringing together this collective work that really seems to have turned the corner in psychotherapy in general, and it's really such that I think it already has turned the corner where most therapists soon will be incorporating some aspect of body-oriented work in their clinical practice.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyhow, you do have to train yourself. I mean, you do have to, how you observe the other person's body. As I say, the one method is to track your sensations in relation to their sensations and their affects, your sensations and your feelings. And the other is to observe their behavior. So you see changes of heart rate, you see changes in color, reflecting the autonomic nervous system. But you also see very subtle changes, you see facial expression changes. Paul Ekman has done a great amount of research on this, and this originally comes from the work of Charles Darwin. Mm-hmm. In his second and at least as important book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, where he shows that emotions are innate survival mechanisms that have evolved in the mammal species and is used for many different purposes, but mostly to prepare us for action. So therapists can train themselves to see these facial expressions, to see fear, to see anger, to see sadness. Now, generally these things occur very quickly. So the person doesn't, they don't show fear for more than, or sorrow or disgust, often for more than a fraction of a second. So therapists need to, train themselves to be able to see those expressions. And also there are postural shifts. So the very slight raising of the shoulder, almost imperceptibly, could indicate fear. It could be indicate, in other words, the shoulder's trying to protect the person from being hit by something. And so as a therapist is able to bring the client's attention to those teeny movements that are underneath these postural adjustments, they again come to these ways that the body had defended or protected them. And often they'll have memories of the trauma, as did Nancy, but that's not the operative. That's not the important thing. Mm-hmm. The thing, again, is to replace the feelings of helplessness with those of empowerment and competency, with feelings of terror and helplessness, with feelings of goodness and well-being. And all of that is registered in the body. See?
And so just again to slow down, something that people who are not so familiar with your work might not notice is you're saying the important is not especially to notice the memory or to notice, but actually to release and escape that feeling of helplessness to come to that feeling of power and competence.
That's right. In other words, if images and memories do occur, that it can be part of it, but that's not what the healing is about. It's not about remembering. It's more about remembering. In other words, bringing these fragmented parts of our body experience and dissociation together in a coherent organism. Mm-hmm. So the memory. Now, of course, in some cases, memory is very important, especially if there's a possibility that some kind of ongoing abuse is occurring. So getting accurate information can be important in protecting other people. But by and large, the absolute details of our memory isn't what's important. Mm-hmm. And it's restoring power and discharging this incredible survival energy that we mobilize. That's why the autonomic nervous system is so hyper aroused. It's for the fight or flight, and it's this kind of mobilization that allows a mother to pick up a car and to pull her trapped child out, from under the car where the child's legs have been caught.
Right. So maybe that's a transition to, we could touch a little bit on how the body is impacted by trauma.
Okay. Well, again, when we're threatened, our bodies prepare for life-preserving action. First, we mobilize the fight or flight response. And again, this is tremendous amount of energy that's mobilized. In that moment before, when I was hit by the car, my arousal was off the charts. And, as evidence, my heart rate was about 180 when they took it, when I was on the road. But being able to discharge that energy is what helped reset my nervous system. Where is it? I have my I Ching here. There's I think it's hexagram 51. When a man has learned within his heart what fear and trembling mean, he is safeguarded against any terror produced by outside influences.
Wow.
There's something. Yeah, that was written both between 2000 and 2500 BC. So 4,000 years ago. And that's a wallop of wisdom here. So if we aren't find a way to not be overwhelmed by that, actually to channel it and to resolve it. You see, in studying ethology, it occurred to me, look, if a person is robbed, say, or somebody comes up and holds a knife to their throat and says, give me your wallet or I'll kill you. There's a possibility that person's going to be traumatized. So if a person's raped, it's a good possibility that they will be traumatized. Now, and the survival responses that are evoked, the fight or flight and the freezing, the immobility response, the collapse, again, these are all survival responses. And, excuse me, get a drink of water here. And when we complete these responses, you see, it's the fact that they're incomplete that causes the problem. So, with Nancy, she was, her desire to run and escape. That was what was incomplete. And so when we complete, I'm reiterating a little bit, but when we complete these responses that were incomplete at the time that we were overwhelmed, then we go out of overwhelm into being present. What was the question you asked me again?
Well, it feels, I was asking you about how the body is impacted by trauma, but this feels very nice as you're saying it, as a very nice way to, in a way encapsulate the way your approach to trauma is very different from some others. It's not about, say, necessarily remembering, understanding, but what you're talking about very clearly is a sense of completion, of natural responses that the organism has in order to deal with threat and danger, and that have been blocked.
That's right. And when you do this, through this bottom-up approach, right? Verbal psychotherapy is the top-down, down approach. When you do this bottom-up kind of approach, then what tends to happen is spontaneously the person will then experience certain feelings and emotions associated with either with the event or just with coming back into life, and they will also be able to make new meanings. So, some people say, well, somatic experiencing doesn't work with meanings. That's not true at all. Actually, the basic core organizing map in somatic experiencing is called the SIBAM model. sensation, image, behavior, affect, and meaning.
Mm-hmm.
When you work from bottom up, the person gets these new meanings. In other words, when you've been traumatized, we have a reified, a fixed meaning, and that may be, that I don't have power over my life, or life is dangerous, or things are dangerous, or I'll never be able to find, somebody to love me, and all of these kinds of things that come from our different traumas and socialization. And when the person starts to move through the core of it, which again is in the non-voluntary parts of the nervous system, it's in this archaic, primitive part of our brain that's 300 million years old. Once we're able to talk to it, to dialogue with it through sensation, then and complete the incomplete responses and discharge the undischarged energy from the survival response or from the survival responses, including fight, flight, freeze, and collapse, then that energy is restored to us to engage in life. So again, the container for all of this is the body. The body is impact. The body tightens. It stiffens. It retracts. It collapses. This is the impact of trauma on the body.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But the body is also the seat of all of our good feelings, the visceral feelings of warmth and happiness, the muscles that are normally toned, so that when we walk, it looks like we're dancing. I teach in many different countries, and it's always a bit of a shock to me. Because I usually go from the States to Brazil, and then from Brazil usually to Germany or Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a difference of how people walk. And you think about somebody like Nelson Mandela, even with all the trauma that he's had, and
mm-hmm.
advancing age, you saw a man who walked with grace.
Yeah.
And when we're able to restore that sense of grace, which is a birthright, it's in our body, it's there, it's genetic. We are wired to feel good. We are wired to want the things that are good for us. Unfortunately, that gets messed up along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So trauma, the body is both really the target of trauma, but it's also the primary resource in resolving trauma, and in providing to us new meanings in life.
Yeah. So, Peter, as we're coming to the end, I'm wondering if there is something that you would want to add, or actually what's coming to me, my impulse is almost to prompt you to tell the title of your upcoming book, because I think that after hearing what you said, the words of the title acquire a deeper resonance and actually sum up very much a lot of what you've been saying.
Okay, yes. Well, listen, let's follow your impulse, since we're talking about following impulses.
Okay.
The title, and it took quite a while for it to evolve, the main title is An Unspoken Voice. And actually the first chapter where I talk about my accident, the name of that chapter is The Power of an Unspoken Voice.
Mm.
So the title of the book is In an Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness.
And I think that's a very, very powerful summary of what you've been talking about in terms of trauma and release and goodness and grace.
Yes, thank you. And it is about grace, and that's generally what people experience as they move through these previously terrifying, immobilizing states. They just reconnect with the sense that they're alive, that they're real, that life is something to be lived. To have witnessed this for 40 years, to see people go from shutdown and hyper arousal really being engaged in life and into relationships. It's been a privilege beyond words.
Thanks, Peter. This recording is part of the Proactive Mindfulness podcast. We explore how to be more present and engaged in our lives and how to make lasting change. This is a contemporary take on mindfulness, informed by embodied therapy and the polyvagal theory. You can find more articles and videos on the website proactivemindfulness.com.